had given you a question here to start our time with the Gospel of John, in part because it is so pretty well known, as I had said before, in terms of New Testament writings. Is there a favorite passage that came to mind, a story, etc., for you? So I have a mic here. I'd love to be able to pass that around. Oh, let's turn that on. I'm sorry.
Is that on? Okay. Am I on? My favorite is John 15:5. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. And I can.
That's great. Yes, the vine imagery is. I've got actually a little icon in my office of that, so it's wonderful. Oh, here we go, right over here. I think you may have to turn it back on.
My favorite is the one where he says, I know my sheep and my sheep know me, and they hear my voice, they recognize it.
So some of the shepherd imagery, but particularly that passage is especially rich. Yeah, I know my sheep and they know me, they know my voice. All right, amen. Other passages that stick out to you. Elgin over here.
The one that stuck out to me is, and the Word became flesh. God acted on our behalf, and we are the recipients, not the doers.
Yeah, so chapter 1, right? Those first verses, which are so soaring and powerful. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Word was God, was with God, and became flesh and dwelt among us. Yeah, Tom.
In throughout John, there are all sorts of I am verses, and one of them that stands out is I am the resurrection and the life in chapter 11 with Lazarus.
Okay, the I am verses, in particular, the I am the resurrection and the life. Amen. All right, hold on, one more over here, Jeff, and then we'll come forward to Deb.
Just to build on the verse that Elgin used, he quit too soon. I use the Message as my study Bible, and that phrase in the Message is the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. I love that, as it moved into the neighborhood.
Yeah, I remember that in particular because I think when I first came here, we were doing the Year of the Good Neighbor, and we were preaching on those verses, and that phrasing was so striking, right? Moving into the neighborhood. That's right. It's the Mr. Rogers verse. There you go. Would you pass that up to Deb?
Well, one of my favorite verses, I have several, but this one sticks out this morning, 123, particularly because I live in Africa and felt called to go there. I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord.
So John the Baptist verse, obviously, but has resonance for...
Well, that's what Isaiah said.
Right, yeah, excellent. All right, thank you all for sharing. So let's kind of jump in together. And I'll say my approach as we typically move through will be what many of you have become used to. Those of you this is kind of your first time joining us, is we walk through sections and passages, and I try to give you a theological interpretation, and we also try to draw out some practical implications as well. So that's sort of the way that we're going to approach things as we move through. Basically, today is really an intro day, and we're not going to get into the text itself. I'm just going to do some background information, which I think is helpful for us to think about maybe the intention of the author, et cetera, those kinds of things. what exactly is a gospel. We'll talk a little bit about that, et cetera. One thing we can say is, I think to start off, and I feel like I would be remiss as a church historian if I didn't say this, but in the history of the Christian church, this is probably one of the most important single documents that we have in the New Testament, maybe alongside of something like Romans or something of that nature. It is a very, we might even say densely theological account of the life of Jesus. I'll talk in a little bit about this, but you probably already know that John feels different and is different than the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I think we've had, even just with the eye test, but also through centuries of scholarship, we can see there's clearly some interaction going on between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's some influence going on there. John, in a way, stands apart. There's some overlap. There's some places where they touch, but John is clearly distinct in a way. And one of the things that's so distinct about John is that it's more overtly theological in a way than you might encounter in some of the other synoptic gospels. So, for instance, if we were doing a study of the Gospel of Mark, we might be struck by what we might say the incognito element, right? The hiddenness of who Jesus is. There's not really a lot of hiddenness of who Jesus is in the Gospel of John. It's pretty much on display from the beginning to the end. Though there are some places where that's worked with in a paradoxical way. So, and in addition to this, I think there's a couple things we can say in terms of the history of the Christian church. Number one is there's kind of an adage or a colloquialism or an idiom that I've run into when I was in seminary, which is that most people, we think about the narrative story of Jesus according to the synoptics, the way that they tell the story, but we think about the words that Jesus says primarily through the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John really has become central in the way that Christians think about who Jesus is. It's also the Gospel of John, and many of its passages have played a very important role in theological debates over the history of the church. For instance, in the 4th century, when they're debating about the doctrine of the Trinity, the Gospel of John is a central text that they're arguing about how to interpret certain passages, how to understand the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Spirit, etc. So we're going to run into some of those things here and there. Sometimes I might mention some of that stuff, but I'm going to do my best to stay kind of centered and focused on what the text is trying to tell us, and maybe also speak into our lives in the here and now. So let me start then. Introduction, basically intro discussion is aimed at getting at questions like who is the author, when might this text have been written, what does that tell us about some of the dynamics that are going on inside of the text, and then what are some of the key themes. So that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit about. The first thing I want to do, though, is reiterate something that I talked a little bit about with certainly the Gospel of Luke and even the book of Acts, because the book of Acts is a little bit more similar in a way than, say, the epistles, etc. That left to Janet. Okay. Thank you. So first question is, what exactly is a gospel, right? And I'm talking here, obviously, on the one hand, gospel means good news, right? That's sort of the translation of the term. But as a genre, what is a gospel, right? And these documents that we have are unique. They clearly are influenced by certainly the Hebrew Bible and maybe some other materials that authors would have been familiar with beyond, say, the canon of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. I think one way of thinking about this, and certainly the way that we will work with as we move through, is that this is a sort of a theological reflection on historical realities. And that's what I mean when I say a mixture of history and theology. We have here historical remembrances, right? People who witnessed and remembered. They might have even written down in little bits and pieces. We have to, of course, remember that literacy rates are extremely low, and people had very, very good minds. So they were able to remember things much better in a way than we do, because the reason that we don't remember things is because we wrote it down, so we wouldn't have to remember it, right? So the text then, we could say, is rooted, or the story is rooted in historical remembrances, but then on top of that, it's interpreted, right? There's a perspective that the text comes from, and I typically would say that every document, frankly, the thing that links all of the documents of the New Testament together is that all of them speak about someone who has died but is alive. So all of them speak from the perspective of the resurrection. That's my point of approach. So that's what they are operating with as they think through these historical remembrances. How do they connect eventually to where the story winds up going? So historical remembrances, importantly, of course, is the trustworthiness of those remembrances, and the text itself talks about and wants to establish and affirm its own trustworthiness to listeners and readers alike. And I think what I would suggest, discovered over the course of a couple millennia, one of the reasons that the church consistently returns to these texts, the Gospel of John among them, even though these are hard texts, and sometimes they say things to us that we don't want to hear, the reason that we find ourselves returning to them again and again is because we have discerned that we still hear God speaking to us through them, right? That there is, in a sense, God speaking to us. So the trustworthiness of the witness doesn't just have to do, in other words, with the historical witnesses. It has to do, in a sense, with the voice underneath, right? That the Spirit, essentially, I think is what we could say. We've already mentioned this particular text, and I think one of the things that makes the Gospel of John so interesting is it seems to be somewhat unconcerned with making sure that it coheres precisely to the Gnostic Gospels, or not the Gnostics, but the Synoptic Gospels. And I will say this, and I'll kind of mention this again later on, but I think there's a pretty conclusive sense that the Gospel of John is probably the last of the Gospels written. So my point is simply that the author or their community would have known that these other texts existed, I would think. And if they didn't, that's even more interesting, right? That you would have texts as important as those others, and maybe there's another tradition here as well. Lastly, this idea of a theologically shaped document, this is not something that I am coming up with. This is not something that was generated in the 19th century or by Luther. This is something that's very, very old. All the way back to, as I mentioned here, Clement of Alexandria is one of the first to describe the Gospel of John as having a kind of special status in a way. And in an attempt, in a way, to describe the uniqueness, he described it as a spiritual gospel. That is a gospel where the voice of the Spirit and the theological meaning and truth of who Jesus was is much more on the surface. You don't have to dig quite as deep as you might in the other documents. So, who is the author of the Gospel of John? Now, this has been an interesting theory area of debate, and actually it's a pretty ancient debate. I was kind of rereading some of the stuff and kind of refreshing my own memory around this. The first thing we can say, I think, pretty definitively is that everyone kind of agrees that the gospel names the author as the beloved disciple. So if we are going to work with the kind of a trustworthy or a hermeneutic of trust, in a sense, with this question, we can start by saying, okay, there's a figure in the gospel that we hear about who is described as the beloved disciple. It's not clear precisely if this is John, but I'll come back to that in just a second, because pretty early on people associate, and that's where we get the name. But the beloved disciple is what we get. It's really, though, starting in the mid-2nd century. So Irenaeus is a very important early church father who was originally from Turkey and eventually winds up in southern France. And he winds up as a bishop in the city of Lyon. And he is one of the first people to ascribe this gospel to John, the son of Zebedee, who we hear about in this gospel and the other gospels. And that's where the name Gospel of John kind of originates. So a John person. That's pretty early on, probably within a couple generations at most, because I think, as I'll mention in a few minutes, the Gospel of John is probably written pretty late 80s, 90s. So we're talking here within 50, 60 years potentially. Yeah. Can we send that? That's a great question. By the way, you can always ask questions. This is where a lot of the fun stuff happens, is when you ask the questions.
Yeah, just when's the Bible or New Testament become canonized?
So canonization, typically we point to a process that, first of all, it's a process, number one. And we might say it's provisionally settled in the 4th century. So we're still a little ways away from that. Yeah. And I can give you all kinds of details if you want them, but I don't think you do. but if you do, let me know. Yeah, Terry, go ahead. There's a mic.
I've always heard from various, I guess, people that really know the Bible with a lot of detail, that the Gospels preceding John's were written before the destruction of the temple. So they tend to have different, end of the world feelings. But John, being so much many years after the destruction of the temple, it's kind of like, well, the world has already ended for the Jews. So his gospel, because it's after that, is sort of different, or
yeah, I mean, this
more
is
contemporary or recent.
Yeah, this is one of the kind of theories to help explain the difference. I mean, so the issue is these gospels over here, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're different, but they're profoundly similar. John is clearly different. It doesn't take observation, essentially. You wind up with that. So that becomes sort of the generative problem that then leads to questions like this. Yeah, I think it would be fair to say certainly Mark, which is typically understood as the first of the Gospels written, is either just before or just after the destruction of the temple. And then Matthew and Luke, which typically are understood to be influenced by Mark, they're a little bit later, maybe 10 years, something like that. And then John. So definitely I think we are in a situation post-destruction of the temple. Now that doesn't mean that the remembrances that are the basis of this are post, right? They're rooted in events that are prior. But the way that they're being told and thought about are often being shaped then by other dynamics that have developed between when the events happened and when this document is actually written. And I won't be overly, this won't come out that much, but from time to time it might, if it's helpful for us to kind of get out what we think is going on in the document. So I'm not going to be looking for all the precise places where that plays out, but sometimes it is helpful and we will draw on some of that. So other options that have been developed over time, and these are kind of a little bit more recent. One is there's a multi-source theory, or the belief that the Gospel of John in some ways is knit together by multiple authors that come out of what they sometimes call a Johannine community. The other option is a different John. Yes, John is the author of this gospel, but it might not be John, son of Zebedee. And that actually connects us to our last figure whose name here, Papias of Hierapolis, definitely an obscure figure from the early church. I had forgotten who he was until I was just reviewing my notes. So he's not someone that sticks in your memory. But there's a series of letters, basically, that Papias writes to his community, and he's based in Ephesus. And he is of the conclusion that the author of the Gospel of John is the same person who authored the book of Revelation, the elder John, who was not one of the disciples, but he's clearly in the kind of stew of people, and that this person is based in Ephesus. So rather than this being a document that's produced out of Palestine, this is a document that's produced out of Ephesus. This has some interesting possibilities, in part because it could help explain why the Gospel of John feels different. It feels more like it's engaged with Greek and Roman thought. It has more of that spiritual quality. There are these dichotomies between darkness and light, et cetera, those kinds of things that are more pronounced in a way in this gospel than they are in others. And some have said this seems to be the influence perhaps of Greco-Roman ideas or thoughts. So the one thing we can say, having said all this, and what we'll operate with basically is John, I'll certainly probably speak about John in the singular, is that the author of this gospel is also to be connected to the epistles of John, that they sound similar, they talk about the same themes, they use some of the same imagery, etc. Whether or not the person who wrote the book of Revelation should be included in that is an open question. I personally would say I don't think that this is the same author, but there's plenty of people who have different opinions, and some of that is rooted in good historical scholarship. So I'm not interested in having to refute it, I guess is my point. All right, let me stop there and see if there are any initial questions before I shift us through. All of this will be on the exam. It will. It's very true. Yes, that's a stock joke that you're going to hear several times over the course of this time. All right. So what about dating and provenance? Dating, of course, is the timing, and provenance is where is this generated out of? I won't go into a great deal other than simply to say widely seen as the last of the Gospels to be written, probably late first century, possibly early second. I don't know if we need to nail it down precisely, but we're definitely talking, 80s, 90s at least, something like that in terms of timing wise. So I think that helps us to understand why we get maybe more explicit statements about who Jesus is. And what I mean by that is, when I think about the experience of the disciples, for instance, or of the people that were around Jesus, they walked with Jesus, they spent time with Jesus, they heard him teach, they experienced his crucifixion, which would have been, of course, a criminal's death, and the shame that would come with that. And then somehow this person lives. So now they got to go back through their memories and figure out who on earth was this person? Who is this person? I don't fully understand. So even if they have messianic ideas, et cetera, they don't come to meeting Jesus with an entire theory about who Jesus is precisely. Or if they do have a theory about who Jesus is, oftentimes the Gospels show us that they need to have their theories rethought, right? So over time then, the community itself is experiencing Jesus in other kinds of ways through the power of the Spirit, and they have more time to reflect on, right? To refine the way that they understand who Jesus was and to understand the import and meaning of some of his sayings. And so I think that's a good, helpful way of thinking about why the Gospel of John feels the way it does, rather than seeing it sort of as which is sometimes the way it's posed, which is a kind of rereading or overreading, over-determining about who Jesus is from a different type of perspective. All right, dating and providence. So providence is, where does this come from? One of the things to note is, it raises the question of, are we dealing here in a sense with two different traditions about who Jesus is? Which is possible, right? I mean, when you have someone that extraordinary and you have that number of people around them, and then they scatter in some way, if we can kind of, I think, take the portrayal of the early Christians and the predicaments they found themselves in, that they wind up getting scattered out of the book of Acts. Naturally, you could see different traditions and different ideas growing out of that. I mean, just think about the congregational meeting that we've had, how we all hear the same sort of information and we have different interpretations, right? So it's not like it's some sort of strange thing, right? So one of the things then we want to note is that the Gospel of John clearly shares some of the traditions with the other Gospels. It shares the basic shape of the gospel story as well, right? Jesus coming, sort of almost appearing in a way. It's actually much more like Mark than it is like Matthew and Luke, because we don't get a narrative story, an infancy narrative story. Jesus appearing, going through some sort of, ritual affirmation having to do with John the Baptist, calling disciples, having a public ministry, which includes both teaching and works of power, getting into trouble with the authorities, being crucified, being raised from the dead. That's the basic story of Jesus that we find in all the Gospels. So yes, John operates with that frame. But then there are, sayings that are different. There are parables that are different, and even some of the stories that John shares with the synoptics, those stories are told from a slightly different angle, right, for a different purpose. So, noting then, right, that there's similarity but also difference. And that difference, oftentimes, commentators and scholars will note, has also to do not only with the retelling, et cetera, but also the imprint of other influences. And so the three here typically that are brought forward are Jewish influences. And by Jewish, I mean, of course, not only the Torah, but also there's been actually in the last 50 years, my understanding, a significant amount of research that suggests influence from the Dead Sea Scrolls community, that community which is typically called the Essenes, and some of the images that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's an awful lot of interesting parallel, right? So some people have made those arguments. So it's not just sort of the straightforward traditional Jewish, there's also some of the other elements. Hellenistic, refers to the broader culture, right? So Greco-Roman culture, ideas that we might associate sometimes with Plato or someone like that. There's some imagery of that type that you could say. And then even because of the timing of when this document is written, there's a suggestion of what typically ultimately comes to be called Gnostic, that maybe there's some elements there either influencing or John influencing those developments. I can say that of all the Gospels, the most popular among the Gnostics was clearly John. And the very first commentary ever written on a New Testament text was written in the 2nd century by a Gnostic on the book of John. So the entire idea of writing commentaries on the Bible, it starts with a Gnostic, and it's on John. So this idea then, it can't be easily dismissed. But again, we'll be careful as we move through. These are just kind of background things for consideration. As I mentioned before, Papias, but also Polycrates, they both argue that this gospel originates out of the city of Ephesus. Other than that, I have not been able to really find many other great options, partly because I didn't go into super deep dive into Johannine studies to prepare for this morning. I don't know if we need to know all that stuff as well. So Anyway, let me stop there and see. Someone's like, yes, I agree. Thank you. It can be very confusing, yeah. And a lot of it's fascinating to think about, but at the end of the day, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to be put into touch with something beyond some of those questions. But let me see. Yeah, Terry, would you pass the mic over to Jeff over there?
The omission, or I guess we'll call the omission, of the birth narratives seems kind of a big omission when those are parts of it. Maybe we just love the baby stories in the other Gospels, but it's, I mean, and if he was aware of the other Gospels, he obviously knew of the birth narratives and just chose not to include them. What line of reasoning would he have used to not even mention those?
That's a great question.
Thank you, I thought it was.
Yeah, that's right.
It deserves a great answer, too.
Oh, wow. Oh, boy. Okay. What kind of theological abracadabra can I pull out now? Okay, I think it'd be fair, first of all, to note that our first gospel is Mark, and Mark does not have an infancy narrative. So one theory is that Matthew and Luke have access to some traditions that have to do with sort of some of the infancy stuff, but they're also trying to answer the question of where did Jesus come from, because it's a question that sort of has come up in their communities. And so we want to take seriously that these documents are not just written to preserve a memory for generations, but sometimes they're also written to directly address questions in their communities, right? So you get Luke's account and you get Matthew's account, and the accounts are different, right? So is the difference then of the accounts, does that create then a new problem or a new set of questions? That could be one option, one way of thinking about it. And then we come to the Gospel of John, and what we don't get an infancy narrative, but we certainly get an origin story, right? So we've moved beyond Mark, where literally it's just like Jesus appears and he comes out of the desert and he's like, I'm going to preach the kingdom of God. At least by the time we get to John, we get a kind of more refined answer. And obviously that answer that John gives to us is clearly deeply shaped by the book of Genesis, right? And sort of the imagery of creation itself there. So that is the best, I guess, model that I've come across to help explain why. At the end of the day, we don't truly know because we don't have some of those editorial notes, but it is a question that's worth wrestling with, I think. So, nicely done. Hold on, let's pass that forward.
No, I was just going to say, John does go back to the very beginning
Right.
of creation and shows Jesus is in that flow of creation.
That's right.
Is it on? Oh, okay. Was it the Council of Nicene that decided which books were going to be in the Bible?
No, it's a little bit after that. And it's sort of, as I mentioned, it's provisionally settled. So there is a figure who's typically associated with the Council of Nicaea. So Nicaea happens in 325. And I think there's a festal letter. So there's a pastoral letter that is written 367, 368 by a figure named Athanasius. And that is the first time that we see the list that we're all used to in the New Testament. There were earlier lists, and there's a long history of debate about what should be accepted,
Right.
what can be read even if it's not authoritative, and what should be avoided.
So what were all those other documents? And, they went through to end up with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Well, usually the arguments are about documents that start appearing particularly in the 3rd century. So these are like Gospel of Thomas is probably second century, but Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of James, Gospel of Peter, a lot of these documents start to appear in the late 2nd into the 3rd century. And those are oftentimes labeled under the title Gnostic Gospels because they've been shaped by or they're productions of Gnostic communities. Usually, interestingly enough, if you read a Gnostic Gospel, they don't really tell a different, well, I shouldn't say that. They sometimes will tell some details about the life of Jesus differently, but typically they don't, it's not a narrative story. It's usually a collection of sayings. So most of the Gnostic Gospels assume the existence of the other Gospels that tell you the kind of overarching story. They just give you the hidden information is essentially kind of the way. So church figures are kind of arguing about, and they come up with multiple categories or criteria by which they say these documents should really be seen as having authority. And what they mean by authority literally is what is to be allowed to be read in public and preached on. And therefore, in other words, this is the common documents that we're going to have as the basis for our arguments with each other. And yes, they are arguing from the very beginning of the history of the church. And so I say that if we're arguing right now, we're in good company because it's been going on for a long, long time. So, yeah.
Remind me what Gnostics are.
So, well, boy, these are.
Who are they?
They were one of the early offshoots within the Christian family. They begin sort of within the Christian family, and then eventually kind of through a series of, kind of conflicts and debates, they wind up sort of outside, founding their own churches and having their own Bibles, essentially, their own. In fact, the first ever canon of the New Testament comes from Marcion, the great Gnostic. And he was originally he came from a wealthy shipping family in Turkey, and he winds up migrating to Rome, and he becomes a member of the Church of Rome. And apparently he gave a very large sum of money to the church to help, but his ideas become so contentious that they can't make him leave because they don't have the power to do that, because that power doesn't exist in the history of the church at that point in time. But he decides to leave, and he migrates to Palestine. And in Palestine, he starts to found his own churches. So he would be one of many that we might have. And so usually Gnostics operate with the idea that there's public knowledge. There's the public teaching and the public events that are all associated with Jesus, and all that stuff you can find in the 4 Gospels. But then there were other moments when Jesus pulled one of the disciples aside. Peter, Mary Magdalene, Andrew. There's a whole host of them, and in those encounters gave the secret knowledge. Right, and so the secret knowledge then is connected to a different cosmology, a different way of imagining the universe. They usually are not very pro-women, even if a woman winds up as the primary protagonist. It's typically because she's acting like a man, is the way that the documents actually frame it. So, and they typically are pretty negative about creation itself. So creation for a Gnostic is your body is not something, it's essentially something that you need to be rescued from. And I think the opposite of that, the Christian, the way that the Christian tradition develops is God is not trying to rescue you from your body. God is interested rather in redeeming your body, in redeeming creation, redeeming history, rather than getting rid of it. So. That's as far as I'm going.
Are there any Gnostic churches today?
I'm sure there are.
Really?
I'm going to move on. I mean, there's certainly people will argue Gnosticism is a part of our culture, our cultural heritage now. So, okay, the occasion of the writing. There are 2 things I just want to highlight here. So occasion is what prompted the decision, to create this document. And obviously we're speaking historically here. And I'm not trying to discount that the occasion was being compelled by the Spirit. I'm just saying historically, what can we say? One thing that does come up and that we will be paying attention to is the protagonists in the Gospel of John are pretty much universally in that document named the Jews, all right? This has led to the Gospel of John having a very checkered history among Christians, and particularly for Jewish-Christian relationships. So the idea of Christian anti-Semitism, essentially, which is rooted in certain assumptions that early Christians make about the relationship of the church to the synagogue. There's clearly some kind of conflict, early form of a conflict between Christians and Jews that's going on. And what we want to remember, of course, is that almost all these early Christians are Jewish. So this is not an ethnic conflict, but it clearly later on, because of that history, it becomes that way. So that's what I mean when I say we're going to try to be attentive to this as we move through to frame precisely what we mean. Now, what this has led to, and this is especially pronounced in John, is I think a working theory that one of the things or one of the events that's going on in the life of the community that produces this document is that they are in a true conflict with their Jewish neighbors, right? So there is some sort of conflict between early Christians and early Jews. And to the point, some will argue that these early Christians who produced this document perhaps themselves have been expelled from the synagogue. And what I think is so interesting, of course, about this is that we do have significant evidence that shows that, of course, not only are almost all of the early Christians are Jewish, but they're also attending synagogue typically. They're going to synagogue and then on Saturday, and they're going to church, ecclesia on Sunday. And they don't really see necessarily a conflict in that. And so it takes time for some of those differences to kind of work themselves out. So we want to say then, number one, that this terminology that we run into, the Jews, is in no way to be understood as applying to all Jews. It doesn't even make sense in the flow of the text itself. Why? Because Jesus himself is Jewish, right? All of his disciples are Jewish. Everyone that's following him at this point, there are no Gentiles really involved unless they're clearly explicitly named as Gentiles, right? So we have to keep that in mind, that this has a different meaning than simply a kind of ethnic meaning. We also have gradations of Jewish figures in the Gospel of John. So one of the great examples I think of here is Nicodemus, who is a key figure, right? He shows up very early on and then shows up again later on in the story. And so we see even Jewish authority figures. Not all the authorities can simply be lumped together, because I do think that that's one helpful additional way of thinking about this. So here's what I have written up as we think, and kind of what I'll be following. And from time to time, we'll try to use this as it's useful, that the title, The Jews, is attached to those who, from the perspective of the author, have decided against the claim that Jesus is the Son of God, Son of Man, right? In other words, someone who has made a decision that they do not accept the witness of Jesus, and therefore the witness of this document, right? Remember we talked about the importance of that category of witness. So that's, I think, a way. So this is an argument, in other words, about the status of Jesus. And someone who has not accepted or embraced what, from the author's perspective, is the proper status understanding, they are going to be labeled the Jews. And of course, that has had, again, also a long history of abuse. So we want to make sure that we are careful. I also think the other layer here is that typically these figures are associated with those in power, right? So this title, the Jews, has to do with synagogue officials, temple officials, or we might say the Pharisees, who would have had a certain kind of rural authority, et cetera, and would be associated with the synagogue as well. So oftentimes, in other words, this is a dynamic, it seems to me, between people with power and sometimes people without power or with less power, et cetera. In addition then to that, right, this conflict, we might say, or maybe we should say, I think we can add another reason, another layer. So this is a sort of concluding statement here, is I think most of the Gospels, they do have an element of trying to preserve a memory that's fading, right? So we're talking now about, 40, 50 years of memories that have been handed down orally, and there's a whole field called orality studies about oral cultures and the power and efficacy and precision of memory prior to the invention of writing. So we don't need to worry necessarily about whether or not that's the case, but it is oral and oral passing down. Well, the living witness, though, is starting to pass. And so we want to preserve this in a way that's even perhaps more codified and maybe more stitched together, right? It's not just a collection of scenes, it's actually a narrative, right? Something of that nature, we might say. And then I think the other reason seems to me to be that we could put on the front burner is to deal with this conflict that we've described above, a conflict between these early Christians and those who don't accept that message, but particularly those would be within the Jewish community. One of the basic, and now we're kind of starting to bleed into the themes in the gospel, and I know that's my next thing, and I know we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to get to it ASAP. But one of the key themes of the Gospel of John, really, I would say probably the most important theme for the reader, is to provoke you to answer the question, who do you say that Jesus is? Right? Do you accept and receive or not? That seems to me to be a key element in the writing of this gospel. That to encounter Jesus is not just to encounter a person, it's to be confronted in a way, right? And so I use this language of an apocalyptic confrontation. You have to choose one way or the other. And that certainly seems to be the perspective of the author. Okay, before I do the themes, are there any? Hold on, we do have a question.
There we go. Also, one other thought was that it could be, when dealing with the word Jews, of Judeans as opposed to Israelite. The Galileans, where Jesus was from, is in the north, and so you get a north and south conflict as well. Also urban and rural.
Those could also be dynamics as well. So thank you. All right, moving then into our themes. And I pretty much, there's a lot of themes, but I've tried to kind of just couch them under two big, broad headings. So the first one is Jesus, God's Word. And I mean that here just like it says, that in a sense, Jesus is the embodiment of God's speech, essentially. So what do we mean by this? What are the claims, in a sense, that are being made? I think the first one is the idea that it's not just a human life that's on display in Jesus, it is the life of God. That God, in a sense, in Jesus is speaking to us, and what God is saying is that it's not just a speech to us about us, it's also a speech about who God actually is. And so Jesus, in a sense, embodies, right? This is why we talk about the incarnated word of God. And we get this imagery at the very beginning of the gospel, and it sets our expectations pretty profoundly. That what we're watching here, in a sense, is an extension of the story of Israel, right? The story of Israel is not just the story of Israel, it's also the story of Yahweh with Israel, right? So it's also a divine story, or a history of the divine life. Well, now this is being extended and intensified even more, because in the earlier history, you might be able to say God is alongside of Israel. But now, in a sense, God is inside, right? God is one of the Israelites. God is this Jew. God is this person. And that's kind of the idea. Now, underneath this is the assumption, right, that only God can speak for God. And therefore, this is one of the kind of arguments for why the witness is trustworthy, because it's more than just the human community, the human authors that have penned this. There's something else behind this claim about who Jesus is and the way that we're hearing about it. The next thing I think that's very important is that this speech is not simply about conveying information about God, but rather it gives life. For God to speak to us isn't just for God to tell us something that we need to know. It has a far more and deeper sensibility about it. Whatever it is that God says, it brings life. I mean, we think about, of course, again, the beginning of the Torah, right? Those opening chapters of Genesis, which I think are so important to the imagination of the author of this gospel. What is it that when God speaks, both light and life happen simultaneously, right? Light comes forth, and all of a sudden, the possibility of life is happening. So when we think about this word idea, we want to keep that this is not just conveying information. All right. Secondly, then, underneath this, we can include what we've already talked a little bit about, the witness idea, right? And this is multi-layered. There is, of course, the witness of the document itself, of the Gospel of John. But that's not the only place where we run into witness language. There's a witness of John the Baptist, right? He is a witness. And ultimately, the true witness is Jesus himself, right? And so how are we going to receive what he has to tell us, right? So that's this is a multi-layered kind of idea. Now, this notion of witness is not just invented with the Gospel of John. We can find forms of it in the Old Testament and the prophets in particular. As I mentioned up here, the book of Isaiah uses this idea quite a bit. So legal testimony. So when you think about, when you're thinking about the category witness and you hear in your mind, dun dun, right, from the show, right? What is it called? What's the show that does the ding ding? Law and Order. There we go. Yeah, thank you. We all know it so well that we've completely forgotten it, right? Dun dun. That is the category or the place out of which some of this is coming. So we have a combination then of what and of course the point in a sense is for us in this room now also to become witnesses, right? To become those who bear testimony to what we have experienced, what has happened to us, and what we have seen and heard about who Jesus is. So this text has an agenda, and the agenda of it is to conscript all of us into the same thing that the text itself is already doing. It is witnessing to the true witness, who himself witnesses to the living God and invites us to be a part of that whole economy, right? So it spills beyond the edges of this text. So divine and human witnesses to God's doings in the history of Jesus, but also now in and through the gospel itself in the church community by the power of the Spirit, right? We hear a lot about, or we start to hear about, I should say, the Spirit a little bit in this document. And then I won't spend tons of time here, but we'll just say it fits, right? If we're talking about a description of who God actually is, and Christians eventually come to confess something like a Trinitarian vision of God, then it seems natural that we might encounter some of this. And of all the Gospels, this is certainly one where it's kind of the most palpable. So God's Word on the one hand, Jesus, God's Word. On the other hand, Jesus, God's work. There's clearly some blurring of lines here, so if something sounds familiar, forgive me, but I'm going to run through this again, just keeping the eye on the clock. Probably, to me, one of the most important categories that we're going to encounter in the gospel around this question of work is the category or the concept of glory, glorification. So the language of glory appears in multiple different places. It comes out of the Old Testament, the Greek word that's usually used here, doxa, is a translation or a kind of an equivalent for the word kavod, which has to do with the presence of God. The Greek word, though, carries additional connotations and kind of adds those in and layers them in, and it has then to do with the glory, that sort of the splendor, in other words, that surrounds a king. So that sense of God's presence and the splendor and the power of that presence is an element of this. So glorification, God is king, and therefore the work in and through Jesus, including the work of his humility, is an expression of what it means for God to be king, or what it means for God to rule. And I'll just make the argument right here that the place in the Gospel of John where the most paradoxical moment, really, that we get multiple hints about God ruling is on the cross. That the cross itself is a moment of glorification, right? You would think it would be the opposite, right? All of our conceptions of a king would tell us dying that kind of death is where profound and true weakness are found, right? Not power. And of course, what the gospel tells us is that it is precisely in the midst of that weakness that God's own power is on display. And so this is one of the deep, deep truths that we're going to encounter in terms of the type of work that God is going to be doing in and through Jesus. So crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus are central as we think about this work. Almost half of this gospel is taken up with the journey towards the passion and the resurrection. And then that sounds pretty good. That's a pretty good ringtone. So the cross, as I mentioned here, the cross certainly expresses, it's an illustration in a sense of what it means for human beings to reject God, and to reject what we might call righteousness, etc. And we will certainly play with some of those ideas because they're a part of the story. But ultimately, it is an expression of God, of what God is willing to undergo on our behalf, right? And so we want to talk a little bit about, and in so undergoing that, God does not surrender God's kingship. God is still very much right in the midst of that, also king. And that changed the way we think about what it means to be king. I think that's one of the great points of this. So then, in addition to that, the gospel, or this gospel text, takes up the extension then of that work. So if we're saying in a sense that in Jesus God is glorified in all these different kinds of ways, does that spread out? And what the gospel suggests to us is that it does begin to spread out through the life of the church. So we get a couple places where we have some sacramental elements that come up. And of course, the power of the Spirit, right? And of course, it's the power of the Spirit that really is pushing it through the church, frankly. So, and so as I mentioned here, right, life of the church through witness, sacrament, and love for others, all of those are energized by the power of the Spirit. With the ultimate question being, as we encounter, as this reality that generates and energizes and moves us towards loving ourselves and others beyond, that too then provides the possibility that others may encounter that and have the same type of question posed to them. Maybe it's, and I think that God poses this question differently, but similarly to all of us. Because some of us can handle and we need the confrontation, and others of us need the invitation, right? So we need to, I would suggest we want to leave that as a kind of open thing. But the idea is that whatever it is that God is doing in Jesus has not stopped with Jesus. It's also going on in and through us, right? That's sort of the vision here. Okay, we have just gone over a couple of minutes, and I want to give time for you just for, I'd say, let's say 3 minutes. If you need to go, you can obviously take off. This one little question here: what are you looking forward to as we move through the Gospel of John together? I'll give you a couple of minutes at your table. We'll share, and then we'll dismiss and be prepared to come back next week. Okay, I just want to bring us back for just a concluding couple of comments. So I left this question: what are you looking forward to as we move through John together? If there are any thoughts that you'd like to share with our group. So no one's looking forward to nothing.
Just that it's such a wonderful book, and to re-engage with it, as Elgin brought up, we're really looking forward to it. So
Excellent.
Maybe this doesn't make any sense, but You know, Jesus only said and did what he saw his Father doing, so it's no wonder his words were profound. And I was just saying, he didn't heal everyone. He healed all who came to him. He didn't heal or fill all cupboards that were empty or build houses for everybody. So I'd like that brought out more. I mean, I'm not sure what I'm even asking you, but trying to.
So you're interested in the particularity of what Jesus said and did. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. I think we'll call that. Let me just say a concluding prayer. Thank you for the claps on the first day. That's actually, I don't know if that's ominous or yeah. And obviously, we want to keep Pat in our prayers. I will say, Mark Patrick, it turns out, was already over at Methodist, so he's going to be checking in with her. So we will be sure to be in touch and knowing how she's doing, and hopefully she'll be back with us again next week. So. Well, it may be that Mark was already there visiting him. I'm not sure, but yeah. Floyd Paulson, you said?
Floyd Paulson, Lorraine, is a big part of the men's group, and Lorraine's hearing has limited her going to church. But his cancer's back, and he was diagnosed last week with pneumonia. Not good.
Is there any other folks that we want to put on our prayer list?
Barney has a skin thing that she has to have double checked to make sure it's not cancer. And, biopsy and all that from just going into the dermatologist to have both of our annual checkups. They found something on her where they had to do a biopsy. And today she finds out. And I'm hoping it's denied.
Yeah, of course.
We don't need anything more wrong with Mark.
That's right. That's right.
My grandniece in Hawaii has melanoma. She's 28. She's had the surgery on her arm and a lymph node removed, and she's waiting for more results.
What's her name?
Allison, Alison.
What's her last name?
What is her last name? She just was married.
Allison Keith.
We'll do all of these.
Okay. All right, let me just pray as folks are leaving. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the time that we've had together to study. Thank you for the presence, as we said before, of having EMT people on site to help with Pat. We pray that you are, and we trust that you are present to her right now and carrying her along and bringing along others alongside her. We think also of Floyd and Lorraine and Marnie and Allison and the different needs that they have, Lord, that you will be present to and attending in those places and spaces, bringing your healing hand, but also your peace and the focus that's needed to make sure that each of them receives the kind of treatments and health care and care that they need. We ask and pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.